The disappearance of Judge Joseph Force Crater 1930. Joseph Force Crater's work and political connections finally paid off. After graduating cum laude from Pennsylvania's Lafayette College in 1910 and then Columbia Law School in 1913, the Easton, Pennsylvania, native worked as a law clerk. In 1920 he was hired as a law secretary for then State Supreme Court Justice Robert F. Wagner, until his boss became a U.S. Senator in 1926. Crater then entered private practice, doing much work for Wagner's firm. From 1917 onwards he also taught law at the City College of New York, Fordham, and New York University. Crater was a busy man. He also became involved in Democratic Party politics, controlled in New York by the party's political machine of Tammany Hall. His fortunes grew, as did his involvement. In 1927, he and wife Stella bought a cooperative apartment on New York City's Fifth Avenue. They paid off the $5,000 mortgage of Crater's parents. By 1929, Crater was president of the Cayuga Democratic Club, the base of support for Tammany District leader Martin Healy. Healy was later investigated for selling judgeships. In February 1929, Crater was appointed receiver for the bankrupt Libby Hotel. Within 4 months, Crater sold it to the American Mortgage Loan Company for $75,000. 6 weeks after the sale, the city of New York wanted to seize the land under the Libby to widen the street. The American Mortgage Loan Company sold it to the city for $2.85 million. On April 8, 1930, New York Governor FDR appointed Crater, then 41 years old, to a post on the New York State Supreme Court. Crater's nomination to the highest judicial post in New York County surprised many people, but he was confirmed by the state Senate within 2 days and sworn into office a week later. The Association of the Bar of the City of New York supported the choice, and Governor Roosevelt won kudos for the appointment. Senator Wagner was in his law firm's New York City office preparing to leave on his annual European vacation, when Justice Crater visited him on August 1, 1930, to wish trip. Then Crater took his chauffeur-driven Cadillac and went to his lakeside vacation cabin near Belgrade Lakes, Maine, to rejoin his wife. The community was north of Lewiston, near the center of Maine. Couple had bought the country house in 1919. Crater was returning to Maine after spending 2 weeks in New York City and Atlantic City. Crater and chauffeur drove through the night to get to the cabin. The Craters went motor boating with friends that Saturday, ate dinner out, and went bowling in the evening in the village. Joseph told a neighbor at his country home that he planned to stay in Maine for 2 or 3 weeks. The Craters had no phone at their cabin, but a message was delivered to them from town that evening. Someone had made a long-distance phone call to the drugstore for him. He went into town and returned the telephone call. When he returned to New York City the next day, "I've got to straighten out a few people," he said. Stella asked no questions. As Crater left the cabin in Maine on August 3, 1930, he told Stella that he would be back on August 6, or at the very latest in time for her birthday on August 9. His chauffeur dropped him off at the train station in Maine. Upon arriving in New York City, Crater went to his apartment at 40 Fifth Avenue. He talked to his housemaid and asked her to come back to the apartment on August 7 to tidy up after his departure for Maine. He said that he wouldn't need her again until August 25, the day he was due back in the city for the opening of the Supreme Court term. The day after returning to New York City from his cabin, Crater had lunch at a nearby restaurant and went to see his doctor, Dr. Albert Raggi. In the evening, Crater went to see the play Ladies All with his friend and fellow lawyer William Klein. Afterwards, Crater headed over to Club Abbey. It was owned by Owen Auntie Madden, a Liverpool native with a violent past. Crater spent time at the club that evening with Elaine Dawn, a singer and dancer who had recently appeared in Show Boat and Artists and Models. Then he went home. On August 5, Crater went to Dr. Raggi's house for dinner and an evening poker game. The game ended sometime between midnight and 1 a.m. Crater went home to sleep in his own bed for what would be the last time. August 6, 1930, Crater only had one minor case on his docket that morning, and then he returned to his chambers. He sorted some papers and destroyed others. He asked his assistant, Joseph Mara, to cash 2 checks and bring him the money. One was for $3,000 from his account at Chase National Bank, while the other was for $2,150 from another account at the Empire Trust Company. After Mara returned from running his errands at the banks, Crater asked him to help bring 6 portfolios of papers to the apartment belonging to the Craters. The cases were later found in the apartment, but the papers were not. As Crater left his chambers, he told Law Secretary Fred Johnson that he was going to Westchester for a swim. Once Crater and Mara had dropped off the 6 cases, Crater dismissed his assistant for the day and reiterated that he was heading to Westchester for a swim. Mara and Johnson both assumed that he was going to the Larchmont Shore Club, of which he was a member. Crater never went to the club that day. In fact, he hadn't set foot in there since June. Instead, he had lunch with lawyer Martin Lippman at the Epicuri restaurant on Stone Street, as he did once or twice a week. Over the course of the afternoon, Crater went home and changed out of the suit that he had been wearing. He set it aside to be sent to the cleaners, and then he put on a brown suit with green pinstripes and wide lapels. He phoned lawyer Reginald Issacs at 5:30 p.m. to discuss a case. Afterwards, he began making plans for the evening. During a trip to Atlantic City, he had seen a preview of Dancing Partner, the latest Belasco production of a comedy by Alexander Engel and Alfred Grunwald. Since the show had just opened in New York on August 6, he went to the Aero Ticket Agency at 7 p.m. and asked to buy a ticket. He told a clerk that he was returning to his cabin in Maine the next day. The clerk told Crater that a ticket for seat D110 would be left for him. Crater went into Billy Haas's restaurant on West 45th Street at 8 p.m. Lawyer William Klein and showgirl Sally Lou Ritz were having dinner there when he arrived. They invited Crater to join them. Showtime for Dancing Partner was at 8:40 p.m., but their dinner didn't end until about 9:15 p.m. Since he had seen the show before, perhaps Crater wasn't concerned about missing the first part. Ritz, Klein, and Crater left the restaurant and said their goodbyes on the sidewalk. It was the last time that anyone ever saw Crater. Ritz and Klein climbed into a cab and headed off together to Coney Island. Crater was still standing on the curb as they left. It was later said that Crater took a cab down 45th Street, but no taxi driver remembered picking him up. Someone collected the ticket that had been left at the theater's box office for him, but the clerk could not remember if it was Crater who picked it up.
The next morning, housemaid went to Crater's Fifth Avenue apartment as planned. She had agreed to tidy up after the judge's departure for Maine. Nothing seemed amiss when the maid arrived. Crater's bed had been slept in, and she assumed that the judge had been there the night before. He had also left a suit and some other clothes for her to bring to a local cleaner.
At Crater's chambers, his staff wasn't expecting him either. After all, he had told them that he was returning to Maine to join his wife at their cabin. For her part, Stella wasn't sure exactly when he planned to return. He had told her before going to New York City the previous weekend that he would probably be back in Maine on Wednesday but no later than Saturday. She went to meet the daily train arriving from New York on Thursday, but he wasn't on it. Unconcerned, she assumed he would be back on Friday or Saturday. 2 days later, it was Stella's birthday and she was beginning to feel annoyed at her husband's absence. A storekeeper in Belgrade Lakes delivered a red canoe that Joe had bought her as a gift. Friends joined her for a birthday party that evening. She wasn't particularly concerned. By August 11th, however, she was beginning to worry. Joe had left for New York City more than a week ago. She went to a friend's home and used their telephone to call Simon Rifkind in New York, who had succeeded Crater as Wagner's law secretary. Rifkind said that he had seen Crater around town but he couldn't remember precisely when. He offered to check if Crater was, in fact, in New York. Stella agreed. By the end of the workweek, however, Rifkind had not contacted the worried wife with any news of her husband's whereabouts. Tired of waiting for news that wasn't forthcoming, Stella instructed chauffeur Kaler to drive to their apartment in New York 4 days later to see if he could find answers about Joseph's whereabouts. When he arrived, he found a large amount of unopened mail. It was clear that no one had been to the apartment in some time. When questioned, Crater's law secretary Fred Johnson claimed to have seen his boss. Rifkin finally sent Stella a reassuring note about her husband. Kaler did the same a few days later. "It looks as if everything is all right," the chauffeur wrote. "The apartment is okay. I haven't seen Mr. Crater, but everybody says he has been around and is all right." But he wasn't. When Kaler went back to Maine a week later, he admitted to Stella that Crater's associates, including Crater's law secretary, had discouraged him from searching too carefully for Crater. They claimed that it could affect his chances for election to a full, 14-year term on the Supreme Court in the fall. District Leader Martin Healy and Tammany Hall were under fire over allegations that they were selling judgeships. Perhaps they did not want anyone to scrutinize Crater's disappearance too closely. By August 25, it had been nearly 3 weeks without word from Crater. Stella was sick with worry. Chief Judge Louis Valente phoned her at a public telephone in Maine when Crater didn't show up at the reopening of the Supreme Court. Now Crater's disappearance was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, and his friends and acquaintances began to realize that he was truly missing. Instead of going public with news of Crater's disappearance, his associates tried to address the matter privately. Assistant Joseph Mara had been picking up the Crater's mail regularly since Kaler had been to the apartment 2 weeks earlier. Leo Lowenthal, Senator Wagner's bodyguard, was a former New York City detective. He visited the Crater apartment and talked to Mara. That's when Lowenthal learned about Crater's destruction of documents, but he didn't see any reason to alert police. The lack of information about her husband's whereabouts began to frustrate Stella Crater. She was tired of sitting on her hands, so she had Kaler drive her back to New York. They arrived at the apartment in the early hours of August 29, and by then Crater had not been seen for more than 3 weeks. She immediately began phoning anyone that she could think of, looking for information about her husband. At 2:45 a.m. she called Tammany's Healy and spoke for a few minutes. She also got in touch with Simon Rifkin and New York City Mayor Jimmy Walker. She phoned Healy again later in the day. Stella and Lowenthal searched the apartment, but the only thing missing was the brown pinstripe suit that Crater had been seen wearing at Billy Haas's restaurant the night of his disappearance. Oddly, he had left behind a monogrammed pocket watch, pen, and card case that he loved and usually carried with him. Lowenthal persuaded Stella to return to Maine on August 30. He said that it was best nothing be done about Crater's disappearance until Senator Wagner returned from his European vacation a few days later. Before Wagner had stepped off the boat, the New York World published a lengthy article on September 3, 1930, announcing Crater's disappearance publicly for the first time. Rifkin, who was first alerted of Crater's disappearance on August 11, finally reported it to the New York Police Department that day. He also told the New York Times in an interview that he believed Crater had been murdered. To help Stella, he deposited Crater's paychecks to the couple's joint bank account and loaned her $200. Less than 2 weeks later she borrowed another $1,000. While Crater's associates said they believed that he had been murdered, the police thought the destruction of documents and the cherished items he left behind pointed to his deliberate and planned disappearance. Wagner, whose ship from Europe docked the day after the story hit the headlines, began distancing himself from Crater. He claimed that they were never more than mere acquaintances and that he had not actively supported Crater's nomination to the bench. For his part, Governor Roosevelt claimed that he had not been influenced by anyone to appoint Crater to the New York State Supreme Court. By September 5, nearly a month after Crater was last seen, stories about his disappearance filled New York newspapers. Police began investigating frantically. Suddenly, there were Crater sightings from Rouse's Point, New York, to Toronto and Montreal, Canada. Detectives followed up on each of the leads, only to discover that they were groundless. Stella stayed in seclusion in Maine but filed an official missing persons report. Crater sightings continued throughout October 1930, but none led to the judge himself. The police department issued a poster with the headline "Missing since August 6, 1930. Underneath his portrait were the words, "Honorable Joseph Force Crater, Justice of the Supreme Court, State of New York." Crater was described as being 6 feet tall, 185 pounds, with mixed gray hair that was originally dark brown, a medium dark complexion, brown eyes, and false teeth. police searched Crater's apartment for the second time, but found nothing. The New York World offered a reward of $2,500 for anyone who could establish a reason for Crater's disappearance. The next day, Mayor Walker offered an additional reward of $5,000. Within days, more information about Crater's activities would hit the headlines. Aspiring actress Elaine Dawn told reporters that she had met Crater over the summer after being introduced by lawyer William Klein. She also said that Crater knew several of the women in the artists and models troupe and they liked him. The next day, the New York Daily linked Crater with Sally Lou Ritz, whom he and Klein had dined with on August 6. Cast members Alice Woods and Jane Manners had also met him earlier that summer. Then Marie Miller, nightclub hostess at the Beaux Arts Club in Atlantic City in New Jersey, was also added to the list of women linked to Crater. Crater was also linked to Constance Bramer Marcus, who worked at the Maurice Mendel dress shop on East 57th Street. Marcus had met Crater in 1922 or 1923 when she was working for the Cayuga Democratic Club. From 1924 until his disappearance, Crater paid the portion of her monthly rent that she could not afford. Meanwhile, the police investigation plodded on. Walter Lippmann, the editorial page editor of The World, publicly pressured Thomas Crane, the district attorney of New York County, to call for a grand jury investigation since the police seemed to be hitting a wall with their own efforts to find answers about Crater's disappearance. On September 13, Crane finally agreed. By then, Crater had been missing for 37 days. The grand jury began hearing testimony regarding Crater's disappearance 2 days later. Prominent members of Tammany Hall said they believed that he was dead. The police's theory was that Crater had had an appointment with a young woman the night of his disappearance, but some of his friends tried to deny his womanizing. In an effort to elicit more information, Crane sent Stella a list of 29 questions, but she was not forthcoming in her responses. More than half of them were either one-word answers or "I don't know." Crane was not satisfied. He began suggesting that Crater may have returned to Maine before his disappearance and that Stella was a possible suspect. Subsequent efforts to compel Stella to come to New York to testify before the grand jury failed. She said that she didn't want to talk about his love affairs, and instead she and her mother moved to a hotel in Portland for the winter, remaining out of reach for the duration of Crane's investigation. Crane turned his attention to Crater's finances. The judge had cashed $5,130 in checks his final morning, leading to speculation that he had taken the money and used it to disappear voluntarily. However, Tammany Hall exacted a year's salary to support someone's appointment to a Supreme Court post. Within less than 2 months after being named to the bench, Crater raised just over $15,500 from the sale of shares and sent Mara to 2 banks to withdraw another $7,500. The combined total of $23,000 was the equivalent of a year's annual salary for a Supreme Court justice in New York County. Crater's safe deposit box was empty, and yet another search of the Crater apartment turned up nothing new. On January 9, 1931, the grand jury determined that there was not enough evidence to conclude whether Crater was dead or alive, whether he disappeared voluntarily, or whether he was the victim of foul play. Stella returned to their Fifth Avenue apartment 10 days later, and that is when she opened a dresser drawer in her bedroom and found 4 manila envelopes that Crater had marked with her initials. Inside were $6,690 in cash, $2,600 in checks dated August 30th, and that Crater had made payable to himself, another $521 in checks, for bank books. Crater's will dated July 4, 1925, that left everything to Stella, the lease for the Fifth Avenue Co-op apartment, and the deed for the Belgrade Lakes house and for some property that the Craters owned in Florida. Crater also had 4 life insurance policies totaling $30,000. Stella filed Joseph's will 4 days after she had returned to New York and 2 days after news of the discovery of the envelopes was made public. His estate was valued at more than $50,000. It included 5 bank accounts worth a total of $12,000, a brokerage account with a $15,000 balance, for life insurance policies worth $30,000, the Fifth Avenue apartment, fees and salary due him, and some Florida real estate. Crater was declared legally dead on June 6, 1939. Stella died at a Mount Vernon, New York, nursing home 30 years later, in 1969. The Missing Persons Bureau of the New York Police Department finally closed the file on August 13, 1979, unsolved. However, the case made headlines again in 2005 after the death of 91-year-old Stella Finucci Good, of Queens, New York. In letters that she left her family, she said her husband learned over drinks with a police officer and his cab driver brother that one or both of them and several other men had killed Crater and buried him under the Coney Island boardwalk in Brooklyn. The area was excavated in the 1950s to build the New York Aquarium, but no evidence of Crater was found.